And let's hear for our first storyteller, Delyna, Diop, who's going to talk about what if I had beneficial ignorance.
Both my parents grew up during the Great Depression in New Orleans. Both attended historically black college. My mother was the first and only one of 5 siblings to get a college degree, and my father was one of 6 with a 2-year minimum college degree. Most college-educated blacks of that era knew that there were few options for them professionally. Women typically became teachers or nurses, and men became postal clerks. My mother became a registered nurse, and my father a postal clerk. It was rare for blacks to be admitted to traditional colleges even up to the mid-60s. I was nearly 5 years old when my parents joined the Great Migration from the South to find better opportunities in Los Angeles. At that young age, race was never something my parents openly discussed in front of us. In fact, in those days, children were to be seen and not heard. We were invited to answer questions politely. How are you? What grade are you in? How old are you? And other mundane questions of that nature before being whisked off to a soundproof room. Once in Los Angeles, we lived in a 2-story Victorian-style house with my grandmother, grandfather, also transplants from New Orleans, and boarders in a nearly segregated neighborhood until the 10 freeway finally replaced it. Eventually, my parents sacrificed and bought their first $10,000 home near Lamert Park. We were the first black family to move into the neighborhood. I didn't realize until much later that our presence caused white flight. In 1961, at the age of 10, I recall my first-hand experience with racism when my family took a road trip to New Orleans. Arizona and New Mexico were uneventful. However, once we got to Texas, the infamous whites only and coloreds only signs were posted everywhere. I also heard a white gas station attendant address my father as boy. My cousin said that this was standard in New Orleans. We witnessed the violent civil rights abuses televised nightly in the early 60s. I remember my parents' insistence that we had to work twice as hard as our white counterparts and not to cause trouble. I grew up in a very strict household with an overprotective but loving father. He scrutinized every friend, every invitation, every extracurricular school event, and set embarrassing curfews. He could have worked for the FBI because I felt like we were always under surveillance. I was still very shy when I got accepted to UCLA. Fortunately, a grant and a loan paid the tuition. Living at home was no big deal in my freshman year, since I got to drive to school in my brand new used Datsun my father bought me. The year was 1968. I was 17. There were protest movements against the war in Vietnam, the cultural revolution of the hippies, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, subsequent race riots, and finally the assassination of Robert Kennedy 2 months later. Okay, stay there. Black people had grown tired of Dr. King's turn the other cheek philosophy and had begun looking to other leaders like Malcolm X, who had been assassinated 3 years earlier, Stokely Carmichael, who coined the phrase Black Power, H. Rap Brown, and Eldridge Cleaver. The slogan Black Power became the rallying cry. Naturals, afros, and bushes were the hairdo of choice and symbolic of black consciousness. James Brown's "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud" was played at every community event. The Black Panther movement, formed by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton 2 years earlier, began gaining respect among progressive blacks. My first contact with members of the Black Panthers was at my first Black Student Union meeting. Soon, members of the rival group led by Ron Karenga, called us made a grand entrance in full regalia. They conflicted over who would run the Black Studies department and over where the next meeting should be held. "We should meet back here in Campbell Hall," argued one Black Panther, "because if we meet where you say, you might off us." The subsequent meeting would end in a deadly shootout. Luckily, I had left the meeting to take care of some school business, only to return to find out that 2 Black Panthers were prophetically offed. Since most believed that the leader of us, Ron Karenga, later the co-creator of Kwanzaa, was responsible for the shootings, most UCLA Black alumni of that era, myself included, will not celebrate Kwanzaa to this day. During my first weeks at UCLA, my counselor required me to declare my major. With 4 years of French and 2 years of Spanish completed, I chose French. Why not? It had such a beautiful ring to it. I chose Spanish as my minor. Problem solved. I moved on campus in my sophomore year. Black students routinely greeted one another. We felt more at home with Black students with afros. The bigger the afro, the deeper the awareness, it seemed. In spite of the unlevel playing field many of us had come from, and thanks in large part to UCLA's affirmative action programs, of which many of us were pioneers, we excelled. We demanded and got more Black Studies classes. We increased our numbers overall to, I'm guessing, some 350 out of over 30,000 students. I understand it's even less today. We felt it was incumbent upon us to move the Black community forward. Oh, wait, that's good. 1969 happened to be Angela Davis's first year as a college professor. It was short-lived. I witnessed firsthand the constant attacks on Angela Davis because of her affiliation with the Communist Party. Ronald Reagan, then governor and member of UCLA's Board of Regents, led the movement to have her fired. We were rightfully suspicious that we were under surveillance by the CIA, because decades later, the government revealed that Black students associated with Black student unions were in fact under surveillance, but by the FBI. I have to admit that most Blacks question my choice of a major in my Blackness. "Sister, what you gonna do with French?" "I don't know," would be my usual reply. "It's too late for me to change now. Besides, I'd have to spend more time here." Virtually no one challenged me on that because few could afford paying more tuition. So there I was, learning a colonial language that was irrelevant to my culture, a language I believe based on the French textbooks and French movies I had seen was spoken exclusively by white Europeans. Besides, they enslaved and colonized my African ancestors. I felt conflicted and worse, I couldn't figure out what I'd do other than teach. Totally depressed because of this dead-end major. Can anybody out there guess what I did? And if you know me, don't say anything. What did I do? I became a teacher? Well, let's see. I picked up an application to the junior year education abroad program to go to Bordeaux, France. But got cold feet. To be honest, my boyfriend at the time didn't want me going away for an entire school year. Besides, I had never been out of the US before, not even LA, except for 2 road trips to New Orleans, Oakland, and oh yeah, the trip to Yosemite. In my junior year, however, I completed the application in spite of my boyfriend. I really wanted the Nairobi, Kenya option, but then it would have taken me longer to graduate. I would now officially be the first one in my family to live abroad for non-military reasons. Breaking news. Within days before my trip, Angela Davis was accused of being the gun owner used by the Soledad brothers, who attempted a failed prison break holding a judge hostage. They were all shot to death. So Davis was pictured on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and was on the run. Many UCLA Black female students with a similar complexion and large afro were often mistaken for her. We became even more paranoid. Davis was later captured, imprisoned, and acquitted a few weeks before the end of my stay in Bordeaux. Out of the 100 students, accepted in the program, there were only 2 other blacks. One female from a Midwestern university with no afro and 0 black consciousness. The other student, a male, had grown up in Mexico and had no real black experience either. So I befriended 2 white progressive female students, both from UCLA. Paris, our first stop, was such a pleasant surprise. So many black people. Most were from the Caribbean or various African countries. French teachers told us the French did not like people butchering their language. With dictionary in hand and in my best French accent, I ordered tea at a cafe. Je voudrais du thé, s'il vous plaît. Then after being served tea, I signaled the waiter to come back. Excusez-moi, où est le limon? I didn't know the right word for lemon, it was citron. Il fallait me le dire, he snarled. Translation, you should have told me. No one remotely prepared me for how rude the French were. Several years later, I learned that the French are usually very cordial when you show a little humility. Also, they appreciate magic words like bonjour, monsieur, madame, mademoiselle, and merci. That's probably why we're called the ugly Americans. We assume everyone should do things our way. Next, we spent a 6-week intensive language training in a small southern town called Pau. I boldly approached a group of African male students, assuming their stares had a brotherly vibe. They wanted to know about the African American experience. Well, partly. Cultural differences. I never did that again. Bordeaux weather was typically dreary and cold until April. Most residents had had little to no sightings of an African American, let alone a black woman. And this one was wearing a big round afro, jeans, and jogging shoes. Most French students wore dresses, skirts, and dress shoes. People pointed at me as though I were from outer space. I wasn't successful meeting French students, nor students from Martinique in the Caribbean that year. Later, I was told that although they looked like African Americans, they relished being called French and rejected anything that had to do with their African heritage during that time. In other words, they were sort of in the same place many African Americans were before the 60s. So I met and befriended students mostly from Senegal, West Africa, and one student from Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. The hospitality and exchanges I had were priceless. I went to many campus parties, ate Senegalese dishes, and began adapting to my new environment. My French began improving too. I looked at education in a whole different light when I realized that many of these students had very small budgets and were there for many years without returning home. They took education very seriously, more so than did their American counterparts, it seemed. They could not graduate high school without having passed a very rigorous high school exam. Only the proverbial cream of the crop were admitted into universities. They also had studied at least 2 foreign languages, including English, had to learn French from kindergarten, and spoke their own African language. I was blown away. I finally had an inferiority complex. I felt so ignorant. Most of the African students were very much aware of the racial problems, yet one student from the Gambia, a small country inside of Senegal, colonized by the British, said she was unaware that there were any black people in the US. I guess they forgot to include pictures in their textbooks too. My boyfriend flew into Bordeaux during my month-long Christmas break. We toured London, Madrid, and Tangiers by train before returning to Bordeaux. It dawned on me that I was no longer into him. I was actually relieved when he left. The highlight of my trip was to the communist countries of the USSR and Poland during spring break with my 2 friends. What an eye-opener. When I stepped off the plane into the USSR, a crowd greeted me with shouts of, "Angela Davis!" over and over again. At the time, we were still in a Cold War with the USSR, as it was called then. Times have surely changed, right? As the three of us tourists walked around, there were undercover police watching us at every turn, blocking shots of our camera from time to time. I pointed out that I felt like I was back in the US. My white friends were indignant that I made that comparison. It was evident that there were two Americas. All in all, I'm so glad I forced myself to do that year abroad. I received my BA in French. The tortured decision to study abroad truly opened my horizons, gave me new insights and a newfound confidence. I returned to France a year later, enrolled at the Sorbonne, and ended up getting married in Paris to a Senegalese guy I had met during my first trip abroad. I moved to Senegal with my new husband, where I ended up teaching English for 2 years at an elite military high school. I felt like I had gone full circle and returned, in a way, to my roots. We eventually moved back to the US, where I went back to UCLA as a graduate student. When the French textbook writers were about to publish the next textbook, I urged them to include photographs that reflected the true diversity of France. They did. While working on my master's degree, I earned tuition money as a teacher assistant, teaching the first 3 years of French to undergraduate students. I received an MA in French, got a job teaching elementary subjects with LAUSD some years later. We returned to Senegal in 1989, 13 years and 4 children later, with child number 5 born at the end of our 2-year stay. The 2 oldest ones thanked us later for that experience. We then relocated to Maryland, where I became a middle school French teacher. Back to California, and after 14 years, mostly teaching French and some Spanish at Washington Prep High School in South LA. I finally retired 5 years ago. My passion for lifelong learning, international travel, and tennis continues thanks to Donald Means back there, raise your hand. Our wonderful tennis coach who introduced me to OLLI. So back to my story title, What If I Hadn't? Beneficial Ignorance. What if I hadn't continued to major in French? What if I hadn't filled out that application? After hearing this story, my daughter asked, "Mom, you mean the only reason we are here is because of your lazy decision not to pursue another major?" Basically, I told her, even today, many black college students still shy away from studying abroad due to the fear of being isolated culturally and socially or for economic reasons. I marvel at many of my UCLA friends today, some of whom benefited from affirmative action programs and became professionals themselves. More importantly, look at how my choices based mostly on ignorance and a general lack of information ended up benefiting me in the long run. For that, I give thanks to my parents, to God, and let me also give props to James Brown.